Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Sinocism Live. I'm really excited today to have Doshi here to talk about what just happened in South Korea, the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, and what it means for U.S.-China relations. Rush, who is on Substack, and I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes. Make sure you subscribe to his Substack called, I think you call it The Great Game. Is that right?
It's just great changes.
Great changes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
Inspired by President Xi.
Rush is the CV Star Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and Director of China Strategy, the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. And before that, he was the Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan under President Joe Biden on the National Security Council, where he served from 2021 to 2024, helped manage the NSC's first China Directorate, and has a lot of actual personal experience in dealing with these kinds of summits and leader-level meetings between President Biden and Xi Jinping. Rush is also an assistant professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and longtime Sinocism readers and listeners know he's the author of The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order from, I think, 2021. Is that right, Rush?
That's right.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. It's great to have you. So I gave a quick bio. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about what your work is, or you want to just jump into what do you think just happened in South Korea and what does it mean? Simple question.
We can just jump. We can jump right into it. It was an interesting meeting. Should we just get into the summit then, Bill?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think people want to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, this is their first in-person meeting in many years, and the first in-person meeting of this administration. So between President Trump and President Xi. So it's an enormously consequential thing to have happened. We didn't know exactly what we were going to, what to expect. Were we going to see President Trump essentially make a series of concessions, largely because of the pressure that we're facing on rare earths, or was he going to, work out a deal on a variety of other sectors that look more equal? And I think where we landed, we've got some details. We don't have all the details, but looks like it's not the worst case scenario some people feared, but there's still some challenges with the way that it all went down. So let's just work through the elements, Bill. I think the first thing that we saw was that basically President Trump was willing to lift some tariffs on China, about 10 percentage points worth of China tariffs, in exchange for some progress on fentanyl. Now, we don't yet know what was offered on fentanyl. There's some rumors about what was offered. And having negotiated on fentanyl issues myself, the details really matter a lot. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we have clarity yet on exactly what that quid pro quo was. But that's one area of interesting progress. A second question has been about Chinese purchases of U.S. goods. And for President Trump, maybe for political reasons, a top one was obviously the export of soybeans to China. Now China's committing to buy soybeans, and the numbers we're hearing from the Trump administration would mean that we're basically getting back to the exports to China that we had a year ago before the trade war.
And that was that Secretary Bessent today saying something like 25,000 billion a year? Is that right?
Right. And so that is a number similar to, I think, what we were exporting in 2024.
But I think it was also a similar number what we were exporting in the first Trump administration, wasn't it? Before the first trade war?
That may be the case as well. I can't recall that number specifically. But what I think is interesting is that it's essentially a return to the status quo ex ante on soybeans, and almost a return to the status quo ex ante on one aspect of tariffs. And then, of course, the third sort of significant event was the decision to potentially export some advanced AI chips to China. We don't have the full details. President Trump indicated we're not going to be exporting the Blackwell chip to China just yet, but we'll see how that sticks. He also said that it'll be for NVIDIA to sort out with China, which suggests maybe there's some more flexibility here than we thought. It looks like maybe the next, another chip that's very powerful, the B30A, may not be exported either based on President Trump's comments on Air Force One, but we don't know that for a fact either. So either we're giving away the best chips or we're not. And the delta between those two is extraordinarily important for Americans, and we don't have granularity on where we've landed.
Right. And then the other thing I'm reading from the minister, China's MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce's readout, they also said that the U.S. side will suspend for 1 year the implementation of the expanded BIS 50% entity list rules that they announced on September 29th. And that appears to be sort of a like exchange for the U.S. side gives up or pulls back on that expansion of export controls, and then the Chinese are supposedly going to pull back on their expanded rare earth export control regime. They announced what they said announced in response to that move by BIS. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So that was kind of the fourth element of this package that I was going to get to. I think, Bill, you nailed it. Basically, the Chinese have suggested a 1 year postponement of their October 9th rare earth exports licensing regime. And it looks like in response, we are offering a 1 year suspension of our 50% rule, which would mean, we have some kind of parity there. I will just say that their licensing regime is not the most important question in some ways, because even independent of the licensing regime, we are still seeing China sort of throttle the flow of rare earth minerals and magnets, not just to the United States, but to countries around the world, including Europe and India, among others. And so the decision to not move forward in effectuating a licensing framework that was itself extraordinarily expansive and asymmetric may not mean as much if American companies still run out of rare earth minerals in other ways. And there are some signs that that could happen.
And we don't know if this what the U.S. Side, because I mean, President Trump says that China, from his Truth Social post, he said China has agreed to continue the flow of rare earth, critical minerals, magnets, et cetera, openly and freely. We don't know,
Right.
though, if that what President Trump says is part of this agreement, if that applies solely to the U.S. or it also applies globally to, say, the EU. Correct? We still
That's
don't. We're
been a
still
big
lacking
question.
a lot of details.
Right. And I have a theory. I don't know the answer. I don't suspect that the US government was negotiating on behalf of the world here, although it's certainly possible we were that magnanimous. I do think that China probably believes it may have overreached on the rare earth minerals licensing regime. Now, they had reasons to do it, and I don't think it was just about the 50% rule. I think they were going to do it at some point to show the leverage that they had vis-a-vis the United States. But if they decide to suspend it globally, it's in part because they want to reassure the world that they're not being irresponsible with this tool. Because, in part, they don't lose a lot by doing that. They can still continue to situationally and opportunistically
Right.
restrict the flow of these minerals for the simple reason that a lot of the companies that basically produce this in China, there's two big ones, are controlled by the Chinese government.
Right. So you can misunderstandings, paperwork's not complete. The bureaucrat approving it's on holiday. I mean, you can find all sorts of reasons, sort of on a as you said, on a situational basis. And that
Right.
it is interesting because there's a Chinese team going to the EU, I think Friday, or they're arriving today to negotiate tomorrow over these rare earth controls. And it is interesting because in this situation, it looks like, and tell me if I'm wrong, is this the first time that the U.S. has actually given up or pulled back on what the U.S. says is national security related export controls in exchange for something from the Chinese side? Hadn't we historically said those export controls, their national security, they're not on the table?
Right. So we have offered to basically negotiate away export controls under President Trump, which is a new thing. That's a sort of new precedent. But let's take a step back, Bill. How did we even get here? I think the reason all this happened is because the Trump administration escalated intensely, rapidly, almost recklessly against China early in the administration. And then when China pushed back asymmetrically with magnets back in the spring and summer, the Trump administration essentially folded. Now, you could argue, and people do, that actually the Trump administration had no cards to play, so folding was the right thing. Or you could argue that the Trump administration did have cards to play and chose not to, so folding was the wrong thing. But either way, regardless of what side of that debate you take, the result was that China tasted blood in the water. It got a sense that they could play the president, they had his number. And I think part of the reason they escalated ahead of the summit was because they expected that he would back down. And I have heard from folks that that was the calculus. So if that's the case, today we've given up the 50% rule, and we have potentially opened up, perhaps unsolicited, exports of some AI chips to China. But tomorrow, the question of what the Chinese will ask for a continued supply of these minerals is live. We now know, and they know, that they have a tool that they can use to pry concessions from us, and they have power. And so the question is how that power is wielded. And I think in general, the broader strategic question for all of us is, in a world where China is increasingly powerful, how will it use that power, and how do we protect ourselves from it? So I think that some of the past discussions about US containment and all the things we're doing that are negative, they sort of miss the moment. The moment is not one of American containment. The moment is one of American sovereignty potentially being at risk from a very powerful China.
And I mean, what's interesting, right, is I think, to your point about this rare earths, critical minerals related export control regime, this is not a tool they had in Trump 1. This is not a tool they were working on it during your time in the Biden administration, but it really seems to have matured end of last year into this year. And did we not see this coming? How do we think? How do we think there was this sense of this sort of surprise that China suddenly had this leverage? It felt like they'd been telegraphing it for a while.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it was surprising that they had the leverage. I think it was surprising is that they felt comfortable exercising it and believing that the US would not push back. It's true, they did go after rare earth minerals in the Biden administration, but they never threatened or even did anything on this scale. And part of the reason why is I think they generally felt that the Biden approach was not unmitigated containment or massively coercive. They were unhappy with some actions like export controls, but there was also extensive consultation on those actions ahead of time, including on things like investment restrictions and so on. And they generally believed that the Biden administration was committed to managing the competition, not to unlimited escalation. And so there was not a reason for them to reach for this in that period for two parts. One was because, again, they were fairly comfortable that with the idea that managed competition was underway. But the second was that they did not know how the Biden administration would respond to that level of escalation. There was always the potential that when they reached for the rare earths tool in this expansive a fashion, threatening a significant portion of US GDP, that the US would reach for similarly expansive tools, whether that's chip controls that now would be widened beyond just a handful of AI chips to all chips to China, or financial sanctions on certain Chinese companies or banks, or software, any product manufactured using American software, which could also be prohibited from going to China. So there were lots of tools that they knew that the US government had, and they could have, I think they generally were concerned that if they reached for this tool and we responded, it could be bad for China. What I think happened in this case is they were backed into a corner by President Trump with the tariffs. They had no choice at that point, no reason not to exercise the tool when tariffs were already at 140%. So they exercised the tool. And then having done so, they didn't face any response from the Trump administration. And they thought, well, we figured it out now. We've cracked the code. That, I think, is the fundamental difference between what's happened in the Trump administration and what happened in the Biden administration. Because you could argue the Biden administration took a number of policies China didn't like, but never encountered anything on this scale.
Right. No, it certainly seems like from the outside, the Chinese have been very systematic at preparing, sort of building up their sort of countermeasure toolbox. And a lot of people have talked about this, and this really is, I think they found they were smart about it. And so there's no question that shutting off the flow of magnets, I mean, understandably, they don't want them to go into military applications and weapons and that's a different discussion, I think, in terms of, but in terms of being able to really throttle key industrial supply chains in America and globally, I mean, they're at this point, we have no choice. So it really is to be cliched, it really is kind of a trump card, it seems like, at least in the near term. And one of the questions then is if you look at, so as you said earlier, maybe there's a 12-month hiatus on enforcing these expanded export controls, but as you said, it can be sort of handled situationally. Should we assume that part of this deal is that the U.S. also agreed to not do any more export control actions and not, for example, there had been talk about, I think, a 232 investigation around semiconductors, 232 investigation around pharma-related stuff. Is it likely that the Trump administration has basically had to shelve those while we're having this kind of truce?
It's a good question. If I had to bet, I would bet that the U.S. will not be taking significant competitive action against China for the foreseeable future. Certainly not in the not before April, when President Trump and President Xi are supposed to meet, if that in fact occurs. So I do think that even 232 actions in semis or in other sectors will probably be scoped in ways to avoid unnecessary, and from the president's perspective, escalation. And that's probably wise, because if the Trump administration is not willing to push back hard on rare earth minerals, which I think is the case, then we probably should not pick another fight that we can't win. So the only thing I'd question, Bill, is just that, do they have a trump card? I think when you look at American and Chinese entanglement, and you look at the interdependencies across supply chains and in capital, what's clear is that it's complex, that there's a lot of trump cards that they have and a lot of trump cards that we have. They have cards and we have cards. So I'd make 2 points. President Xi was not playing his cards. He played one card, you're right, the rare earths card, but generally speaking, he wasn't playing his cards. He was playing the player that he was up against, right? So to use that poker metaphor, he wasn't playing the cards, he was playing the player. But the second part of this is that when you don't know your own cards and you don't know what cards the other side has, the actual competition is really one of perception. Who do you believe has the high card? If President Trump and President Xi both share the same belief, which is that President Xi has the high card, then he has it, even if in reality it's more complicated. So I do think, and this may be a contrarian view, I do think that there were things that the US could do to have disabused China of the notion that throttling rare earths was going to be costless. Because remember, if you did throttle rare earths, the American manufacturing ecosystem, you're talking about shutting down a lot of manufacturers. You're talking about several percentage points of American GDP evaporating, not all at once, but gradually. That's a significant economic gun to the head. And it would be reasonable for the US facing that kind of threat to have taken actions that would be similarly damaging for the Chinese economy. But both sides would lose there, but that would establish deterrence. What has instead occurred is that the Chinese have gotten the message that we won't push back against that tool. We don't have the ability or the will. And whether it's the ability or the will, the result is the same.
And I mean, I imagine you've heard this from your interlocutors on the PRC side. I've certainly heard it from some, and I see it in the, you can see it in official statements. Is this idea that Xi and China are willing to withstand more pain than Trump and the U.S. is, and so therefore they could play, like to your point, they can play this card or play the player in a way that they were betting that the U.S. side wouldn't play back, because as you said, the U.S. does have various significant points of leverage against the Chinese economy. They are not cost free to the U.S.
Right. Exactly.
Is that sort of how the sense you get from the Chinese side of what they're thinking?
I think that is right. I mean, you have to also see that there's been an explosion of commentary in China, which is very triumphalist. That's begun to become much stronger and much more pronounced since President Trump's election. You see articles from in 现代国际关系, Contemporary International Relations, the Ministry of State Security's journal, talking about the end of the West. It's a provocative title. A lot of people have used a title like that before, but if you look at the content of the article, it is triumphalist. It's saying basically that the Western moment is totally over. Now, we saw some of that flowering of writing in the global financial crisis. We saw more of it in the years after. We saw it intensify under COVID, but I've never seen anything on this scale, having read Chinese sources and try to understand elite thinking in China, that I'm seeing now, which is a sense truly that the moment has come. And I think this trade negotiation, this trade war is a pivotal point, and probably a mistake. The president should not have picked a trade war with China. He certainly should not have done it without preparation. You shouldn't invade Russia in the winter, right? Because that's not a good idea. And you shouldn't pick a trade war with your manufacturing supplier without preparing to mitigate your vulnerabilities first. Well, so there's a reason that the Biden administration never did anything like this, and a reason why it was inadvisable for the Trump administration to have done it. And now that they have, the consequences the whole world has seen, essentially China win the trade war.
Well, so that's leads me to really a related question, which is two questions actually. First is, so to your point about what you're seeing, this increasing triumphalism, that's not just pervading the mainstream discourse, but is also more importantly, and I think in more sort of elite circles, but also will the results of this meeting then sort of strengthen that or fuel that? And then second, how does this deal look to the rest of the world? How do you think other countries see? Because I know the Chinese side is certainly trying to present that they're the country that stood up to America and Donald Trump. Everyone else, groveled, caved, whatever, and I think, but China is again back to this idea that they're the defender of the multilateral trading system. They're the leader of the global South, et cetera. Developing countries. Does this then also enforce that narrative from the Chinese side?
I think Bill, that it does. My suspicion would be that they won't, in state media, be too triumphalist about this meeting. They don't want the president to lose face. But the commentary among academics and intellectuals on social media and in journals, I think, is going to be arguing that this is a key moment, right? This is a moment where the Chinese government was able to successfully weather American pressure so well that they in fact were able to return to the status quo ex ante and then get more from America than was available before the trade war began. So we have de-escalated, and we are now, again, back to where we were in a sense before February, but the terms of play are different. Three things are different. One, we may give up more of our top technology. Two, we have shown the world that they've got the rare earth card on us and that we're not willing to contest it. And three, arguably they have been able to indicate that their back down on rare earths is time bound, not indefinite, so that this problem could come back, and next time the demands or the requirements of the United States could be different. And I think that any objective analyst of this in China will look at this and see some degree of success, that essentially we went wild, the United States, and then backed down in ways that actually did us more damage than had we not gone wild in the first place. And as for the global reaction, I guess I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of foreign officials, ambassadors, diplomats from allied and partner countries in particular. And I think that if I had to be honest, their assessment is that we have played this quite poorly, and that Beijing has come out ahead.
I just remember early on Treasury Secretary Bessent describing the Chinese as playing with a pair of twos,
Right.
which again was, I mean, I used a soundbite for media, but I just at the time was quite striking that if that is how the top of the Trump administration sees China's positioning, that was deeply concerning. And I think months on, it seems to have sort of borne out. It does seem like the U.S. side went in assuming they could treat China like they can treat lots of other countries, and the Chinese not recognizing how much the Chinese had prepared.
I think you're right, Bill. And I would say, that very quote in some ways was what I was trying to respond to in a series of articles, which I talked about, which were about underestimating China. So I had a foreign affairs piece, which was titled Underestimating China, and was talking about China's enduring advantages, including in this kind of confrontation. And I do feel that the zeitgeist, basically beginning in 2023, began to be more triumphalist in the West about China, and that was wrong. And the zeitgeist was, hey, look, we did ChatGPT. Russia's invasion, so we can pull rabbits out of our hat. Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't go all that well, so the PLA may not be all that impressive. And China's economy has not recovered properly after zero COVID. So look how great we're doing in comparison. I saw those data points congeal into a narrative beginning in late 2022 with the deployment of ChatGPT all the way to the end of 2024, where that was increasingly conventional wisdom. You would see in foreign affairs articles making that argument. You'd see it in the New York Times. You'd see top officials saying it. It was never something that I found persuasive or compelling, because if you were to look under the hood in China, there were enormous problems, but there were also enormous strengths, as you alluded to, Bill. And all of that led, I think, the Trump administration maybe drinking from that Kool-Aid to believe that they could push the Chinese really hard and they would back down and fold. And that was a really significant, potentially catastrophic mistake that they have made. Now, the United States, it's not like this is the end of everything. I mean, there's going to be more negotiation. There's going to be more investment in American renewal, in American manufacturing. There's opportunities, hopefully, still to work with allies and partners who are likewise being constrained by the rare earths regime. But it's going to all take, very determined statecraft, which may not be forthcoming at the level we need it.
Well, that's one of the questions, right? Is so assuming that the rare earths cudgel, or whatever you want to call it, the magnet cudgel has woken folks up in DC and other, at least other allied capitals. Should we see from the Trump administration an attempt to actually say go to Congress and get legislation around putting together a program to break the reliance on Chinese rare earths? I mean, right now it seems like the administration is doing it in an ad hoc way. We've got investments like DoD investing in MP minerals, the Mountain Pass mine company, and guaranteeing prices, offtake agreements, et cetera. But it seems ad hoc. It can be reversed by Trump's successor. Is this something that should be more institutionalized?
I think so. I mean, I'm not a. I guess I'd put it this way: that oftentimes, when you want to be competitive against another country, we talk about executive branch, the presidency, and grand strategy living there. But the truth is that even in the Cold War, in any competition, the legislative branch for democracy matters even more, right? Because it's the legislative branch that creates the capacity to compete. So what we really need is an institutionalization, which has to come out of Congress. We need a basic program to mitigate dependency after dependency. But I'll add something to this, Bill. We can't do it unilaterally. There are too many dependencies. So the only real solution to compete with China's sheer scale is to have scale of our own with our allies and partners. And if we can do an allied kind of approach where we pick different dependencies and we tackle them collectively and we divide and conquer, I think it's quite possible you could reduce dependencies in just a few years in many areas, whether that's antibiotics or other pharmaceutical products or some of the lighter rare earth minerals that require refining or magnets. It's not easy. It's not necessarily cheap, but it is possible to combine industrial policy at home with allied and partner coordination abroad. Now, what's interesting is that nobody's put those two things together in quite that way before. We've tried a bit, but remember, you'll recall, Bill, that the Inflation Reduction Act, had a lot of Europeans very concerned too. So there's probably ways to do this that take into account the immense industrial scale of our allies, which is really quite significant, but also existentially threatened by China. So that's my template for how we fix this, right? We can't just do one or the other.
Right, and we saw there was an agreement when Australian Prime Minister Albanese was in DC. I think was last week or the week before. Right,
Yes.
the two countries signed an agreement on critical minerals. I want to go back to the what this meeting today meant, but I do have one question for you, which is back to this whole critical minerals rare earths issue. Because I remember during the Biden administration, there was like a working group with Australia. There was a lot of talk. Didn't seem to go beyond more sort of talking and writing, sort of more of a study of the problem. Is that really because the way our political system works is you need a crisis? And is there a chance now that we're actually at the point where this is actually can be seen as a crisis, and so it might actually be more motivating to the legislative branch and to the executive branch to actually get something done?
It's possible. I think the Biden administration definitely recognized this as a problem, and you could argue could have done more to solve it. But at the same time, the efforts that were proposed, including in Congress, for example, more offtake agreements and price floors and demand side support for critical minerals so that the market would invest in that capability, right? Right now, the market, private capital doesn't see this as an industry worth investing in.
It's not a market. The Chinese can underprice and overproduce
Exactly.
anytime they want, and so there's no way to compete if you're doing
Right.
it as a market-based effort.
Right. So you need the state. And really, when you want the state to involve itself in this fashion, you can't do it purely with executive branch authorities. What you need is appropriations and you need institutional authority. And so there were efforts to go to Congress to get this. And to be totally frank, those efforts failed. And that's why, in large part, this failed. If you look at most of America's intractable problems that are structural in this competition, whether that's in the cyberspace and in scaling production and defense industry, or in pharmaceuticals, or in rare earths, there's almost certainly going to be almost principally a congressional element to being able to fix this. So you asked the question then, Bill, if we couldn't get it done then, could it be done now in a moment of crisis? And I would offer one data point. OBBB, right, the big, beautiful bill that President Trump pushed through was a blockbuster piece of legislation. But there wasn't a significant part of it focused on rare earths. There was some that was done. Basically, supply side support, loan guarantees so people could invest. But no one was going to invest without some guarantee that they'd be protected from Chinese price manipulation, and that if they made this stuff, they could actually sell it to the US government and to American companies and not get priced out by the Chinese. Because how many different companies today have owned the famous Mountain Pass mine? That was the basis of American rare earth minerals production beginning in the 1940s.
Right.
Many companies, and they all went bankrupt. And the reason they went bankrupt is the minute they got traction, China dropped the price. So you can do all the loan guarantees you want in the world. Unless you have demand side support, you're not going to fix this problem. And that is going to require some way to keep the minerals that China's putting in here less competitive on a price basis than what we are going to be making at home. And that's going to require government to spend money, and it's going to require government to do offtake, right? We have to invest and buy. The government has to do both. And there's a model for this. It's called, how the US scaled up production in World War II. And we've done this in other sectors before. So we can do it again, but it is going to require bipartisan agreement to spend money. And remember, we're always chronically in appropriation-starved environment. We never have enough discretionary funding for this kind of thing, and that's the problem.
So maybe there's a way to take the $10+ billion in tariff revenue Trump was going to give to the soybean farmers as kind of welfare. Can we just move that over to
That's a smart idea, Bill. Yeah, I like that. That's a good idea.
On Startup China this week, we talked about it. The other suggestion was, do this, but then also get public-private support. Get some of the big private companies like Tesla, Apple, NVIDIA, the car makers who are really invested in having a secure supply of earth, get them to co-invest. There's got to be a way. I mean, again, maybe I'm hopelessly naive about how Congress works, but it just feels like if the U.S. can't see this as a crisis moment after what's been happening over the last 6 months, and after, I think, I tend to agree with how you describe the outcome of this latest round of the trade talks, then it's like, what are we even doing?
Well, right. And so you nailed it. And that's a clever idea to say that the tariff revenue should be earmarked for American reindustrialization. That's the point of the tariffs in the first place. To use the revenue to then fund reindustrialization is quite sensible. I like that idea. If we're going to keep the tariffs, let's spend the money wisely rather than in a kind of rebate or stimulus check. Xi Jinping would be appalled if we used the tariff revenue for a stimulus, since he won't do stimulus of his own. He'd see that as another indication, Bill, of American decline. So you're right. If we can't figure this out, then America's in industrial and broader geopolitical decline.
Then the sort of the triumphalist views of sort of elite sort of policymakers and key sort of thinkers in China is, it helps reinforce that, I think, unfortunately.
I agree with you, and there's a little bit of overconfidence in China too, and you always can count on China to overreach, and so they may push their luck on
Right.
rare earths again, and if it actually has economic impact, it could be galvanizing, right? One interesting thing about China's approach here is that the use of the rare earth tool was threatened to be painful, but the pain was not immediately felt by anybody, really. The U.S. economy did not really struggle. They were careful how they titrated the pain. So what I think that's interesting is it's a very good boil the frog approach. And what they could have done instead is actually make us feel the pain immediately, but that would have been galvanizing, right? So this is
Right.
just the right amount of anesthetic to avoid us getting exercised by what they've done.
And so that is my next question, which is, okay, so it looks like with this, what was agreed to yesterday in South Korea, President Trump's going to go in April to China. Xi, I think, was coming to the U.S. for the G20 sometime in September, October next year. Is that right?
Right.
So there's about, and then apparently, at least the U.S. side is saying the rare earths, the pullback on their expanded export control regime is to last for 12 months. So does that mean over the next 12 months, what does the relationship look like? Like where have we, is this a reset? Is this everybody take a breath and both sides are going to try and, or at least the Chinese side is going to try and figure out how to keep running faster and do their own stuff better? Or are we at the point where actually the relationship could meaningfully improve more than just on a sort of a tactical short-term basis?
President Xi had a quote in 2020 in the midst of COVID, which was "Time and momentum are on our side." If you recall that quote, Bill.
He keeps saying it.
And that quote has not disappeared since 2020. Exactly. No. And so I think that if you ask Xi Jinping about his time horizon, he believes that essentially buying stability now will bring him geopolitical and technological and economic success later. So he's happy to de-escalate this and get a bit of stability in the relationship so he can continue with his plans without disruption. And from our side, we've gotten some stability too, and we bought some time. And now the question is how we use it. So the charitable view of the Trump deal is it's worse, but not much worse than the status quo ex ante. Of course, the biggest harm is that the world has seen the emperor may have no clothes because we backed down twice now in the face of a particular tool. And that has a tectonic impact. But you could argue he's bought a little bit of time. So the question is now, who uses the time better? Who uses this period of relative stability better to increase their own capacity? And so China policy nowadays, Bill, I don't think it's really about China. China policy is about the things you just said. It's about investing in American renewal, and it's about aligning with your allies to get that done. And that is what China policy should be about. I mean, what you do to China matters less and less, given their strength, than what you do at home. And that's where the focus has to be. The problem right now is that Congress is not really set about to pursue that kind of renewal agenda at scale.
They're not even going to work. They're not even working right now.
There's not a government.
It's a month.
It's pretty bad. So, if you're President Xi and you're looking at the situation, you think you've got us. And I have to hope and bet that the ability of American renewal to kind of come out of nowhere and sort of catalyze a new round of prosperity and growth and innovation, that's something in our DNA and our institutions that we can still rely on. We're sort of like a country of decentralized MacGyvers who occasionally come up with crazy stuff in our garages. And even now on rare earths, there's interesting stories about new methods for processing that don't involve solvents but involve membranes. On magnets, there's new stories about revolutionary technology that doesn't involve minerals in the alloy, but actually other approaches to create powerful magnets that are different. I'm not a material scientist, but we have a lot of them in this country, and we have a lot of capital. We're a wealthy country. We can certainly invest that capital to produce outcomes. And here's the thing, Bill, even if we can't do it as well as they can, the market size of these industries is small. I mean, I think the amount of rare earth minerals imported by the United States from China is less than the value of one F-35 in the market value.
But I'm not sure. The thing is, though, right, is the value of the industrial goods and products that rely on these is many hundreds of, so the leverage is, yes, you may overpay for that one small input, but the actual full value of what you're bringing to your economy and your companies is worth taking a loss on some of these.
Actually, that's my point. My point is that is not that this stuff doesn't matter, but rather that the amounts of capital required to turn this around may not be stratospheric, right? It may be doable for the United States, including with innovation and leapfrog technology, with reasonable sums, especially with our allies and partners chipping in. This may not be the hardest problem in the world to solve. It might take a little bit of time, but it's probably solvable. I also think that the Chinese expect us to solve this problem at some point.
Which then raises the question of if they have this powerful card that they can use, and they can actually, if they really turned it on, they can inflict a lot of pain. If they believe it's going to lose its efficacy over whether it's, some people say 10 years. I personally believe that's too long for a lot of the reasons you described about, again, if it really truly is a crisis, there's a lot more incentive for innovation, for capital. Say maybe 2 years, 5 years, pick a number. Does that mean that Chinese will do things, maybe be more aggressive in certain areas in that window, because once we've solved this dependency, that they've lost that deterrence? Is that a risk?
It depends on whether you assume this is their only dependency that they're weaponizing. I mean, the reality is China has other pain points for the United States, and rare earths is one, and it may be one of the most powerful, but it's not the only one, right? They also have advantages in pharmaceuticals, in batteries, and go down the list. There's other sectors too. So the choke point problem that America has here is not confined to one sector, and that means China has other cards to play down the road. Your question is, why do they play that card now? In a sense, perhaps it's because their back was pushed up against the wall by the president. And this is, again, they never played this card the same way, with the same force, even anything like this in the Biden administration, in large part because I think they were afraid of further escalation. Maybe they wanted to keep it in reserve for the Trump administration in case of escalation. And also because they were afraid of the response that the US could undertake. If we have a gun to our manufacturing ecosystem, then we have less incentive to be restrained vis-a-vis them. So I think what got them to play this card, quite simply, was the highly escalatory approach on tariffs that we started out on in this administration. I think it was President Trump's willingness to go to plus 100% tariffs.
145, I think it was.
And once you're at that level, the Chinese cannot compete on the tariff side, so they're going to have to reach for export controls. I'll say one other thing, Bill. I mean, I think this trade war has gone through phases. Like the first phase was the tariff phase. Then the second phase was like the export control phase, right? It was choke point phase. There is the possibility of an escalation to a third phase if this heats up again. And the president, we know, was thinking about this, which is the financial phase. Would we ever reach for some financial tools? And I think China has always expected that we would, and so far we haven't.
No, I mean, China has. There have been plenty of writings about that, and Xi Jinping has talked about, financial war, and Xi Jinping has talked about needing to build an independent, controllable and sort of financial system, et cetera. I think your point about all the sort of choke points that China potentially has over the U.S. from not just rare earths but things like active pharmaceutical ingredients, et cetera. I mean, it is incredibly frustrating because someone who reads a lot of what the Chinese talk about, they've been talking about the choke points and breaking through the choke points the U.S. has on China for many years, and
that's right.
Frankly, are doubling down. We just saw in the last few days after the fourth plenum last week and the sort of the approval of the draft recommendations for the 15th five-year plan that will be approved in March. It's very clear that a lot of that is predicated around high-tech areas, around breaking through U.S. strangleholds, and really, and I think it feels like that document is a lot about better preparing them for what they see as a much longer-term structural, strategic competition with the U.S.
Yeah, and I would say that kind of planning, we kind of date that to the first trade war, but in reality, it begins much earlier. I mean,
yes.
In my own work, when I was reading tons and tons of Chinese documents from the 1990s, work by speeches and stuff by Li Peng, his Nianpu, right, and by Deng Xiaoping in the late 80s, and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. All of them are talking about American economic leverage at various points over China, and China's diplomats talk about it, and they were very conscious of those forms of leverage. So back then in the 90s, the one they were most concerned about was most favored nation status, right, or the lack of permanent normal trade relations. They knew if we removed MFN, which was voted on annually, something like more than half of China's exports to the United States would no longer be competitive. It would really damage China's export machine. And so they had a strategy to be able to basically get permanent normal trade relations from us. Fast forward to today and the trade war. I mean, throughout this period, they've been focusing on closing loopholes, closing points of leverage, closing gaps, blunting effectively American leverage over them. In our industrial policy on the promote side of their agenda, part of that is about controlling the new technology, and part of that's controlling the old choke points. But we know that, they kicked their industrial policy into super high gear beginning in 2006. I mean, they were doing it before that, but we see significant changes in policy documents under Li Keqiang, right? And what does Li Keqiang say? And what do the NDRC economists say in that period? They say that we have to dominate the next round, essentially, of industrial revolution and technological innovation.
Made in
And
China 2025, all those
and
programs,
Made in
right?
China 2025 comes a few years after that, right?
Right.
But that genesis is deep in the DNA of the party, as I guess I'm arguing, and it was extended really 19 years ago. They were thinking about this. So America's inability to grapple with the intentionality behind Chinese industrial policy and technological investment isn't a story of 5 years or 10 years. It's a
Right.
story of 25 years at least, and that is where now the damage is really accrued in our industrial base. It's not irreversible, in my opinion, and maybe I'm an optimist, but it does take concerted congressional action, as we've discussed. Yeah.
And I will just say, again, having gone through the recommendations for the 15th five-year plan, and so the way they've been talking about it, I mean, I read it as quite a confident document. Then this was, and sort of you combine that with the meeting yesterday in South Korea, and I can understand why the Chinese would be confident, because I think they really do have a set of plans that they so far have worked out pretty well for them. And again, to your point earlier, the biggest mistake you could ever make about China is being binary or black and white, right? You can find whatever you want to believe looking at China. You can find the data, you can find the anecdote, you can find whatever. Economy's in the toilet, economy's doing well, right? And so I think a lot of the discourse has sort of got people confused about, and same thing with the discourse around Xi Jinping, being out of power this summer, right? It gets people confused about what's really going on. And so I just wonder, now we've got this, whatever, we'll say it's a day, so I'm not gonna say a year, but we maybe have this truce or this sort of tactical, a new round of putting a floor into the relationship, right? That was a term I think was used a lot during the Biden administration, right?
Yeah, I remember.
Who's gonna use this better?
Well,
trick question.
I mean, our government is shut down, Bill, and we have no congressional plans to fix our dependencies. So by default, it looks like if we bought some stability and we bought some time, right now it looks like the Chinese are positioned to use it better than us. But let's just, it's funny though, you make the point about China's political, the rumors about China's political instability, and people kept saying, oh, maybe Zhang Youxia and Xi Jinping have a problem. Maybe not. It doesn't seem likely. But I will say that after this deal, I think it's less likely that Zhang Youxia will overthrow Xi Jinping. He's probably, if there were ever a possibility, it's a little less likely today because, President Xi did a good job in the negotiations and the PLA can keep him.
Well, I mean, it looks like it just, again, it makes Xi Jinping look like he was actually right about a lot of things.
Well, yeah, there's a point to that. People have been saying for a long time that the danger of trading with a non-market economy is that when they mobilize resources and you have to mobilize markets, it's not one-to-one. And that creates real vulnerabilities. In the Cold War, we understood that. We had a different trading process for autocratic non-market economies than for liberal economies and free market economies and democracies. We treated them differently. We got rid of that distinction. And now we are facing some of the consequences of that, which are, deindustrialization of the country and dependence on China for many goods. I don't want to make it all doom and gloom. I think the U.S. does have enduring strengths. The U.S. is a super rich country, right? So if we were to mobilize our private capital with even a fraction of the efficiency with which the Chinese government can mobilize its balance sheet, we could solve these dependencies. And if you add in our allies, it's not even close, right? U.S. allies, Japan, Korea, Europe, Taiwan, India, the UK, and some of these are not super happy with us right now, but for the sake of argument, put them all together. Together, we're more than half of China. We're 50% more manufacturing value add than China is, right? Our GDP in nominal terms is 3 times greater. We're all richer, generally richer countries with lots and lots of capital we can allocate for these problems. We have industrial capacity that is latent in Europe that Americans fully appreciate and value. We would outscale China on patents, on top-cited academic publications. They're more than us individually. We're more than them collectively. And, we'd be the top trading partner of every country in the world, which provides its own form of leverage. Now, that means that the top problem for the US is collective action at home to mobilize the government, society, private capital, and business to solve our manufacturing problems, and collective action abroad with other countries to get everybody on board with the program. So there's a vertical and horizontal dimension to American strategy that, if mobilized, could be quite effective. And, that is the fundamental task, I think, of American statesmen in the period ahead. They've got to figure out how to do this, whether they're focusing on domestic questions or foreign questions. Those two have to be integrated. But yeah, I think if I'm China right now, I'm Zhang Youxian
Right.
was thinking of overthrowing Xi Jinping, I'm less likely to do it because
Which,
he looks like he's done well.
yeah. And for the record, I never thought he would, but
I don't think that either.
yeah.
I'm making a joke
And
about
I guess
that
from the
rumor.
Trump,
Yeah.
so from the Trump administration perspective, one is the tariffs are still high. They're 47% or so, I think, but effectively, but that's lower than the 60% that he promised during the campaign, right? So I think the Chinese probably are not happy, but okay with it, right? They can live with 47%. Seems like.
Yeah, and
plus there are lots of exemptions.
I meant to make this point earlier, Bill, and I forgot to at the outset of our conversation, which was that the tariff rate now on China is much more competitive with allies and partners than it was previously, right? And so the tariff rate on China is below, I believe, the tariff rate on India, and I think
so,
also
yeah.
below the tariff rate on Brazil, and not that much higher than the tariff rate on some Southeast Asian countries. So trade war one was against China, and essentially the delta between the tariff rate China had and the rest of the world had was large. Today, in trade war two, the delta between the tariff rate China has and our allies and partners have is smaller than it should be. And so, Xi has also prevailed in that dimension, which is the tariff rate on China simply is not as high as it could be if you wanted to diversify manufacturing to other destinations. At the same time, we know that President Xi and economists at the NDRC and other authors who are writing about how to compete globally in China are talking about essentially ensuring manufacturing never leaves China. They want to make sure that China remains a manufacturing power forever. President Xi has been emphatic on this point for over a decade, and he's been more emphatic in the last 5 years and now in the last year. And I think what you are seeing is that the rare earth licensing regime, to go to your earlier question, is not just a tool of coercion against other countries. It's a tool to incentivize more manufacturing to move to China, because you don't have to worry about licenses if you're making your parts in China. You have to worry about them if you're doing it elsewhere. And you'll recall, Bill, that a lot of auto companies were thinking of moving back some of their production to China in response to the throttling of access to minerals and magnets. So we should think about something new, something distinct, that export controls are now a method of consolidating supply chains in your borders and drawing in foreign investment into your country because you've got the thing everybody needs. And that is not how we've thought about export controls historically. I think that's how China is going to use them too, like on batteries, for example.
Yeah, no. Well, part of this expanded export control regime that was announced a few weeks ago it wasn't just magnets and critical minerals. It was also the tools to actually process rare earths. It was batteries and some battery technology. It was super hard materials, including in like some industrial diamonds that are used in all sorts of other industries. And clearly, with the dual circulation strategy that she, I think, first articulated in 2020, the one of the planks is effectively binding global supply chains and manufacturers more tightly to China. Right. And you're seeing it, they're blocking exports of certain talent and machines to India, for example, that Apple wanted to take out because they want to keep these supply chains in China. Makes sense, but isn't really, is weaponizing supply chains in its own way.
I completely agree. And I think this is a missed part of the story, that China has been able to climb up the ladder of industrial technology, in part because many other countries went to China and extended the ladder down. But now, having climbed that ladder, China is pulling it up for everyone else. So the world in which China allows semiconductor battery manufacturing equipment and rare earth manufacturing equipment to flow to India, it's just not likely anymore. And the U.S. has put controls on some manufacturing equipment for semiconductors, but by and large, the U.S. has not ever tried to limit the flow of its technical, managerial, and industrial knowledge overseas. So much so that, in the 1990s, we sold China one of our major rare earth magnet manufacturers. We made them promise that they wouldn't close it down for 5 years. And the next year they closed it down and moved all the capital equipment to China, including the computer software to run the stuff.
And we did nothing.
And we did nothing.
And
that story, copy and paste that across the American industrial ecosystem, right? That's true in lots of sectors in pharma and biotech, and chemicals and so on. So I do think that there is a global question for China, which the U.S. should amplify. The old story is America is trying to contain China. That is a ridiculous story. China is too powerful to contain. It was never possible in the past. Right. The correct story is, will China let the rest of the world have a shot at manufacturing and prosperity? Or will they want to make everything themselves and have everybody else be a commodity supplying country? Lenin, Marx, these guys wrote about Western industrial capitalist societies converting the rest of the world into dependencies. But we have not really done that. In large part, America let its capacity transfer abroad. China is actually doing that.
And
so
reading
that's new.
this talk, the sort of recommendations for 15 5-year plan. I mean, it seems crystal clear to me that's just going to be intensified.
I think that's right, Bill. I think that that's the question we should be discussing. And so people talk about, can the U.S. and China find a mode of coexistence, and that's important. I agree with that. It's something I believe in. I've written about it, and it's something the Biden administration advocated. But one of the planks of that method of coexistence has got to be, what is the role of America supposed to be in the global economy according to China? What is the role of India in the global economy and Europe in the global economy according to China? And what is the future of supply chains going to look like according to China? These are the questions that I think, if the Trump administration were doing an effective job aligning allies and partners, these are the questions they would lead with, which they would say to the Koreans, you used to be the dominant country just a few years ago in the manufacturing of display technology. Today, your plants have been expropriated in China, and now they're producing the panels that compete with yours. You're out of that business. How many more businesses will you be out of in the next 10 years? And that is a conversation I think is happening at some levels in the Trump administration, but it needs to happen at the leader level.
So switching gears, I just want, because I want to be cognizant of your time. We're coming up on an hour, but I just had a couple questions about the meeting and the readout.
Sure.
Going to the meeting, Trump posted Truth Social, the G2 will be convening shortly. What
Right.
kind of message does that send? What is he thinking? What would you guess he's trying to convey?
I'm not really. It's really hard for me to tell you what was in his mind when he posted that. I mean, I think the president sees the alignment with China on global issues as a sign of strength. He's doing a deal with a powerful party. You know, it's not. He's not. It's not like a geopolitical question purely for him. There's a status element to it, and I think that it sends a signal to the rest of the world that you may not want to align with us because we may sell you out.
And is it sort of a different variant of, I think, was it during the Obama administration the Chinese started pushing this idea of like a new type of major power relations? Is this sort of
new model of great power relations?
Right,
yes.
right. Is this feeds into what they want? I mean, the Chinese side should probably be happy with this, shouldn't they?
True. And back then, a new model of great power relations was more about, some kind of parity and mutual respect. Where we're headed is more a world where they may be able to dictate more of the terms of the United States. So the new model of great power relations is going to be, it's not even going to be the deal that they were offering essentially in 2017. It's going to be something quite different. But they do rhyme with G2, yes.
Yes. And then I think the last question I have is really the readout that the Chinese put out did not mention Taiwan. Don't those readouts, I mean, I'm sure you've worked on these readouts, you're very familiar. Don't they usually at least have sort of the stock phrasing around Taiwan in the readouts?
Yes, usually they do. And no leader level meeting that I'm familiar with has Taiwan never come up, certainly in the Biden administration. In other administrations, at various points, it was not always on the agenda, but it was always on the agenda by their insistence in the Biden administration. I will just say there were other few funny things about the summit. I was involved in planning a few leader level summits for President Biden and for Jake Sullivan, and obviously in the National Security Advisors channel with Director Wang Yi. And I'll just say, one thing that was really funny, the Chinese would always be slow to confirm the date of a big meeting. And that was true here. They confirmed the date of this actual meeting, although everybody knew it.
I think on Tuesday, right?
At the last moment, right.
Yeah.
And it's just something they always do because they want us to look like we're more eager for the meeting than they are. The opening in front of the press is always risky. You may recall the Anchorage meeting between Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Yang Jiechi at the time.
I think I remember the video. You were sort of
I'm in the back, yeah.
I was not quite cowering, but I think
I was translating some of what Yang Jiechi was saying because it was not translated simultaneously. It was translated consecutively, and I was trying to pass notes to the rest of our delegation. Hey, this is like he's saying some really intense stuff. You better be ready to respond and have a rebuttal. That was my job as a staffer. The handshake bill in their meeting almost certainly broke protocol. You may have seen President Trump held President Xi's hand for a little longer than I think was comfortable and was just talking in front of the press and taking questions from the press. That is almost certainly a violation of whatever was agreed to between the two sides, having had to be involved in some of those protocol negotiations. So I found that quite unique. On the big picture stuff, not the protocol stuff, obviously Malaysia set up this meeting. What was interesting is Malaysia was several days before the meeting. I remember some of our negotiations would be finished, particularly for the Woodside Summit, which was the most productive summit the two leaders had, the night before. And so that was interesting that, this, in many ways, this deal that we saw probably was more or less what we expected out of Malaysia. And then the readouts are always crazier in the Trump era than they were in the more formal era of the Biden administration. You know, Trump will always do a Truth Social post. He'll always do a gaggle on the plane. He'll say all kinds of stuff. So you have to not just look at the official readouts, you've got to look at what he says.
Right.
And in addition to the Chinese readout on the MFA website, there was sort of like a mini fact sheet that they put out on the deal terms, which was a bit unique too. And I'm not sure how coordinated that was with the United States. So, you know, also on our side, we're having our cabinet officials do the readouts rather than sort of an anonymous senior administration official. So when I look at the choreography as somebody who was involved in it, it does feel a bit more chaotic and a little bit more disorganized, which means for all your listeners, the big question is always, we think we know what the deal was. Both sides think that they know what the deal was.
Right.
Was there really mutual understanding? And that's why I think if I had to give you a prediction for the future, we brought a little bit of stability, but as all things in US-China, exogenous shocks like balloons can come out of nowhere. There can be disagreement about what you agreed to. There's all kinds of ways things could go off the rails, and the rare earth story is not over. So we think we've got stability, but we don't know for how long it'll last.
Right. And I think that's a great point, because certainly seeing the reaction today is this idea that, okay, the stability will be for several months because, you know, everyone's nicer when you're preparing for a summit. And so therefore things should be calmer. And yeah, I mean, I guess that could be a sort of a base case scenario, but as you said, I think it would be a mistake to rule out some sort of exogenous problems, or like you said, just frankly, just misunderstandings.
Right. And I think the big risk here right now is both sides might have different expectations for what they got out of this deal. And it's now up to staff level talks to hammer those out. And those can always go off the rails.
Great. Well, I appreciate your time. Is there anything else I should have asked you? You want to sort of leave with the audience?
No, I think this has been great. I really enjoyed the chance to chat with you. Thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully it was useful to your listeners.
Great. Well, thanks, Rush. And again, Rush is going to launch a Substack soon. Is that
right? Yeah. It'll be called The Great Changes, after Xi Jinping's phrase, "Great Changes Unseen in a Century," the last three characters formed the title of this Substack. It'll focus on, you know, Pekingology and Sinology, yes, also statecraft and policy questions, and applied history and, you know, comparative history over time, so that we can get a better handle looking back at what's happening, looking forward.
And great. And when do you think you're going to start really writing? Is it, you have your first post teed up or soon, or no pressure?
I'll probably put one out there saying I talked to Bill Bishop and here it is. And then probably the second one will be, you know, engaging with some debates in the field about reading Chinese sources.
Oh, I know what that will be, and I'm looking forward to it. No, well, thank you. And it's really interesting because I think Council on Foreign Relations as a sort of think tank is, I think, probably the most forward-leaning in terms of working with Substack. I know some don't allow their fellows, their scholars to actually be on Substack, but they can be on LinkedIn, on Twitter. It's weird. So it's good to see, because I think that it's a very good platform for much sort of longer form, more thoughtful discussion and debate. And so I think that you're going to be a great addition. And we've been trying to build up a really smart China community on Substack, and you're going to be a great addition. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I look forward to it, and it'll be better than being on Twitter.
Yes. Well, thank you, Rush. And again, everyone, you'll if you're tuning in live now, I will post this as a recording, both audio and video. We will have in the show notes links to some of Rush's recent articles, as well as his Substack. I encourage everyone to go subscribe, and hope we can do it again. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the time, Bill.